Karen can't get hold of Councillor Heaney. He's probably did the same thing as we did, forgot that it was 3:30. It was only when a notice came up on the screen. Oh dear, let's go. Pardon? We can indeed. Are you ready? Yeah. Right, okay, thank you. Welcome everyone. I'm Councillor Lynn Stagg, Cabinet Member for Traffic and Transportation. Please be assured that we have put appropriate cleansing and social distancing measures in place to ensure that this meeting is undertaken in a COVID-secure manner. This has included a request for all attendees to have taken an LFD test within 48 hours of the meeting, the use of the NHS Track and Trace app or attendee log, 2 metres social distancing, the wearing of masks when not seated, one-way system in the Guildhall and a temperature check upon arrival. Have you done that? Good, okay. There's limited public seating which has been made available. However, this meeting is also being webcast to allow the public to attend remotely if they so wish. Please be advised that the public seating area is not in view of the camera used to webcast this meeting. Can I please ask members to remain seated throughout the duration of the meeting and to wear a face covering unless seated. Please use only seats marked with the green circle. These seats have been allocated to ensure 2 metre social distancing. Some housekeeping information. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at the turning circle at the end of King Henry Street, past the University's Park building. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust Fire Marshal's regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. Everyone speaking via a microphone be on camera, including those making deputations. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meetings on the understanding that it neither disturbs the meeting nor records those, stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Please, can everyone use the microphones and remember to switch them off when you have finished. Just one point to make, that agenda item number 6, supported bus contracts, has been withdrawn from the agenda today. The contract prices are currently being reviewed for this extension, and therefore this paper will come to a later decision meeting once the finances are understood further. Thank you. Right, some introductions. I've introduced myself. Karen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Karen Martin from Democratic Services.
Thank you. I can't see who's that at the back there.
Hayley Chivers,
Strategic Hayley, I didn't recognise. I haven't got my long-distance glasses on, sorry.
Felicity Tibbury, Transport Planning Manager.
Thank you.
Tim Reynolds, Finance.
Where are we around to? I'm looking, no, I'm coming around this way. I think it's Ian next, is it? Michelle's in the next row, isn't she? Yeah. I thought it was Ian and then going across then to Joe, but Ian, go first. Thank you. Joe. Michelle.
Michelle Lovesafe, Travel Manager.
I wouldn't leave you out for the world, Michelle.
I know. And I could probably still be heard from the next room if necessary.
Pam.
Pam Thurston, Assistant Director for Transport at PCC.
And?
Councillor Simon Bosher, Conservative Spokesman.
Thank you. Councillor Heaney has not appeared, so we're assuming that he's going to come later. Right, do we have any... Oh, what do I do first? Is it members' interest? Any members' interest? No? Okay, thank you. And any apologies? Okay, thank you. In that case, I think we're going to the first. Oh, it says down there. The first item is active travel improvements. And who is doing that? Michelle, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Councillor Stagg. I'm here today to ask for the approval for the active travel improvements budget from Local Transport Plan budget to 2021-22. The recommendations are that we ask for the recommendations that the Cabinet Member for Traffic and Transportation approves the delivery of active travel improvements budget detailed in Appendix A of the report, which will be subject to feasibility and final design work. and also give delegated authority to the Assistant Director for, for Transport to work with Cabinet Member to approve the final designs for each of the active travel improvements. Obviously, the reports were included within the report pack, so I will detail the elements of the scheme. So there is a budget of £100,000 to implement active travel improvements within the city. We worked with local groups, including the Portsmouth Cycle Forum, and conducted site visits to identify areas which would benefit from the improvements. We seek to build upon the east-west active travel corridor that's also being constructed between Goldsmith Avenue and the Hard, and these the measures that we're asking for today will obviously enhance that route. The measures themselves are to install a dropped curb on Hyde Park Road to allow cyclists to safely join the road from the shared use path, to extend the bus and cycle lane on Isambard Brunel Road to form a continuous on-road route for cyclists joining Winston Churchill Avenue, to install a dropped curb on Isambard Brunel Road, Winston Churchill Avenue, allowing on-road cyclists to join the shared use path without having to mount the curb, to install signage and a dropped curb on Wellington Street to create an accessible transition from Wellington Street to Waterloo Street, and to install signage on Grosvenor Street and Green Road to clearly signpost the route. These are in a prioritised list, so we would start obviously with number 1 and work down as far as funding allows. If for any reason the funding does not extend to number 5, then we would look to put that into the active travel improvements budget for the next financial year. The reasons for these recommendations are to make active travel safer, more pleasant and attractive, to improve health and well-being, to aim to reduce traffic congestion, air pollution and carbon emissions, and to improve connectivity and access across the city, especially to the city centre for lower income residents. This complies with the objectives of the LTP4. That's the report in a very shortened form. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Now I'm assuming, Ian, are you doing deputation on this? Simon, do you want to go first, or Ian? Yeah. Yes. Would you like to go? You've got 6 minutes.
Thank you. Portsmouth Cycle Forum welcomes and supports this project being brought forward as it connects directly with the intended east-west active travel corridor, as well as improving north-south connectivity between the city centre and the seafront. We are pleased to see that there appears to be a move away from active travel improvements being developed in a disconnected way that does nothing to create a cohesive and connected network that will assist those people walking and cycling to discover the benefit of giving up short motor vehicle journeys within the city limits. The acknowledgement that the existing arrangements for cyclists is not attractive when using the shared path and two-stage controlled crossing due to the extra time and effort it takes is particularly pleasing, as it recognises that under the government gear change strategy, which was launched last year, that cyclists must be treated as vehicles and not pedestrians. We look forward to these and other key design principles from Local Transport Note 120 being incorporated into future schemes being developed under the new Local Transport Plan and the Local Cycle and Walking Infrastructure Plan. The introduction of drop curbs and signage will also allow easier access for a range of potential users, although we do have some concerns and questions about elements of the suggested design as described in the report, which we would be happy to discuss in more detail as the design develops in the coming months. In brief, these concerns include the exit point from Isambard Brunel Road towards Hyde Park Road to change the angle and incline of the existing ramp, the positioning of the drop curb in Hyde Park Road and how it may be protected against illegal parking to ensure that it is always available for use, how the extended bus lane may change the expectation of where people cycling should position themselves at the entry to the roundabout to travel south or west, the potential for conflict between motor vehicles and cyclists at the eastbound exit of the roundabout. The King's Road roundabout clearly shows that drivers have very little deference for painted lanes on a roundabout. Ensuring that the route is as usable when travelling north as it is when travelling south. This is particularly relevant when the northbound travel reaches the Winston Churchill Avenue roundabout. And lastly, the visibility of access into Grosvenor Street as the existing drop curb access is positioned between 2 parking bays. However, we wish to reiterate that these items can be discussed and further investigated with officers and elected members as detailed designs are brought forward. We support the intentions of the scheme and any future development towards the seafront as highlighted under Part 6 of the report, with the potential to extend the cycling route through Green Road to Castle Road and on to Clarence Pier. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Michelle, are you happy to sort of pick up on those points? Not now, but at a future date. And Joe, are you involved in this as well? The one thing that strikes me, Ian, is that this helps people who are not necessarily experienced cyclists. Because I know when I used to cycle to St Luke's School, I used to be terrified when I got to those roundabouts, and I'd get off the bike and walk it round. But this, I think, would make it a lot easier. But that's just my own observation. I'll come back to you in a minute, Councillor Bosher. Councillor Heaney. Welcome. Did you think it was 4 o'clock as usual? Did you think it was 4 o'clock as usual? All right, okay, fine. I'll let you sort of settle then. Any interest to declare? No? Okay, lovely, thank you. Councillor Bosher.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I mean, I don't disagree with anything in this report, in all honesty. I mean, I'm not a frequent user down here, down in this neck of the woods, so I will bow to the Cycle Forum's view of some of the finer engineering detail, and I expect that will be taken forward so that it improves it for users. Essentially, the only comments that I've really written down is connectivity and strategic, to be quite frank, and it's good to see that we've got a pretty good cycle network throughout the city, but the problem is it's very disconnected. It doesn't join itself up very well in certain places, and there are some potential issues on that, and it's good to see that we're actually looking at things like the east-west connectivity and putting in the strategic bit, so as best as the roads will allow, we are making it as safe as we can for cyclists. And I hope that going forward we adopt that same sort of philosophy on other cycle areas, and I'm sure the Cycle Forum has got an encyclopedic list of areas, as I seem to recollect, where we can do that. But no, I'm totally supportive of what's being done here. I would like to think that I appreciate that the recommendation says delegated authority to the Assistant Director to work with the Cabinet Member, but as it primarily affects St Thomas and Charles Dickens, I'd like to think that the ward councillors in those wards will be kept in the communication loop so that they can have their views expressed at the same time.
Yes, I would automatically include ward colleagues wherever anything is going on. Yes. Councillor Heaney, I appreciate you didn't you weren't actually here for the presentation, but I mean it's more or less a summary of what is in here. And I don't know if you heard what Ian said.
Well, I didn't directly know, but I'm assuming you're very supportive of this. Yes, yeah. But I did go to the briefing, so I've had a chance to ask some questions about this.
Okay.
So
have you got any comments or any questions?
I think I echo my colleague Councillor Bush's on this, that it's doing things to connect up cycling and to improve the junction. I mean, I use that junction with Junction Avenue coming from the university, from the city anyway, and it always seems a bit odd that it wasn't done. So that's very good. So broadly, yes, I think this is a good set of proposals.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to accept both recommendations and ask you, Michelle, if you can sort of set up a meeting at some point with Ian and the ward councillors as well.
Thank you, Councillor Stagg. Yes, as soon as we have some designs, then we will share them with key stakeholders, ward councillors, cabinet members, Cycle Forum, so that we can have further discussion about making sure that what we're going to put on the road can be safe and usable and will achieve the aims that we want it to.
Lovely, thank you. Agenda item number 4, which is speed and casualty reduction measures. I guess that's you again, Michelle? No.
That's me.
Oh, come with Joe.
Hello. So the purpose of this report is to consider the locations and sub-schemes suggested for the 2021-22 LTP budget casualty and speed reductions. The report outlines 3 potential sub-schemes for the £150,000 budget to be spent on. The first key scheme is on Elm Grove and the Grove Road junction. The second one is a budget for generic visibility and awareness treatments at multiple locations across the city. And the third one is for speed surveys to be carried out at multiple locations across the city. The road safety team have worked with data analysts in the transport team to understand the areas in the city and to pinpoint locations in the city where there's a high risk of accidents occurring or reoccurring. We've tried to make sure that we're looking at areas where there's a pattern of behaviour that is that has the potential to continue occurring, and to make sure that we're targeting our funding as best we can to make sure that any interventions that we do are likely to address an existing pattern of behaviour. Elm Grove is, in terms of repeated behaviours and repeated patterns of accidents, it's a very high priority site for us. I won't go through every element of the report, but the factors contributing most frequently to incidents at that site are poor turns and poor manoeuvres and failure to look properly. And we believe that there are some interventions that can be made at that site in order to reduce the possibility of accidents happening and being repeated at that location. We have put forward quite a large proportion of the budget for generic visibility and awareness treatments. One of the things that we've identified when working with the data analysis team is that we have a lot of areas in the city that have got potential for collisions in the city, more to do with poor turn and manoeuvre than to do with speeding. So we've put together a series of locations that we think would benefit from treatments that improve visibility for all users and particularly improve awareness for users who have the potential to cause harm at those locations. We believe, as with the previous budget that we've brought to Cabinet, we believe that by putting together a large list of sites that we can get the best value for money in terms of things like lining on street and ordering signs and things like that. So that's the purpose of that budget, is to make sure that we can get as many different locations undertaken as we can within the funds that we've got available. The third scheme is for speed surveys. We want to be as data-driven as possible going forward, and we get a lot of correspondence in from members of the public, from councillors, requesting speed surveys and expressing concern over speeds on roads. It's something that is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, so we want to be able to react as quickly as possible to that and to be able to use good, robust data when determining where we need to put forward interventions and spend money in the future. So we've put forward a speed survey budget to make sure that we're able to do that. I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Thanks, Chair. Ian, I guess you want to come in on this as well, do you? Good. You'd like to go ahead and I'll come back to you then, Councillor Heaney.
Portsmouth Cycle Forum obviously support the aim to improve safety for all road users in the city. With the road casualty figures for 2020 having been released recently, it is encouraging that a number of cycle casualties in the authorities' roads have decreased around 18%. However, we will only discover how reduced traffic levels during the pandemic has affected these statistics when the 2021 data is released next autumn. According to PCC cycle count data, we know that there were many fewer rush hour commuter cycle trips being made last year, even though the total number of trips around the city was up, as many people took to bicycles for exercise following government health advice. The trial of the Elm Grove Kings Road segregated cycle lanes last autumn aligned with personal commitments that meant I could spend the hour between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. every Wednesday evening standing at the Elm Grove Road junction, counting the number of people cycling through the junction in all directions. Over 11 weeks, the average number of trips per minute during that hour was 1.18. The only week that dropped below 1 trip per minute was on the 16th of December, which was the last week I undertook a count. The fact that the report highlights that this single junction was also responsible for a total of 5 cycle casualties in 2019 and 2020 from a total of 291 across the whole city in the same period clearly shows the need for an improved design. During my 11 hours observing, it was also clear that the junction does not protect cyclists, especially those exiting from Grove Road North. the only arm of the junction that does not have an advanced stop line for cyclists, or perhaps more importantly, is also missing the low-level cycle early release signals. This last point means that cyclists travelling south or west are placed into direct conflict with motor vehicle traffic exiting Grove Road south at the same time and who may be travelling north or east, and therefore creating the very situation highlighted in the report of a motor vehicle turning across the path of a cyclist. I witnessed a number of these incidents last year, and the issue has also been highlighted to us by members. We always request that they report such issues to the Council's near miss reporting tool to ensure that the relevant data is there to be drawn upon in future. We would therefore request that as part of this scheme, a dedicated early release cycle phase scheme is added to the Grove Road North exit to allow people cycling to get further into the main part of the junction earlier and thus be more visible to motor vehicles now moving off later in comparison. The cycle early release signal timings, both here and all around the city, should also be examined to ensure that they meet the guidance as set out in Local Transport Note 120, Section 10.6.40, which states, an early start phase of 4 seconds gives cyclists good priority without unduly delaying traffic. An early start phase of less than 3 seconds is not recommended. Incidentally, we have discovered this summer that the issues of junctions without a full complement of early release cycle phase signals is a trend across the city. Other sites we have identified as Lake Road's right turn into Kingston Road, St Mary's right turn into Fratton Road, and the Copner Road northbound at Burfields Road Junction. Additionally, it was noted on my counts last year that at night the light levels at the junction in Elm Grove are pretty poor, as there are no lamp posts situated within the area inside the controlled crossing points, and therefore a good 25 metres away from the centre of the junction. The addition of high buildings on 3 of the 4 corners exacerbates this problem, and with Grove Road North with the Grove Road North arm being particularly affected and the darkest. I remember being told during my driving lessons that the more lights at a location, the more awareness you need to have as a road user. Even an additional street light closer to the junction may make a fundamental difference to general visibility. Finally, we would like to address the issue around the accessibility of cycle lanes and advanced stop lines. The one improvement during last year's trial that all cyclists agreed about was the fact that it effectively eliminated the constant issue of cycle lane blocking at this location, but only when the posts were not being deliberately removed to create space to park. This has long been an issue with our members and something we've reported many times, as well as highlighting in the consultations around the design of the trial scheme that motor vehicles are free to park here, blocking the cycle lane with only a cursory and insignificant attempt to enforce the parking restrictions. With the abrupt and early removal of the trial, we hope that perhaps the protection of the cycle lane at this junction could be kept, as it was simply enforcing the existing road space allocation as marked on the ground. We can see how the new scheme installed at the same time along Ordnance Row has developed to the point where there are now more permanent bollards segregating and protecting the mandatory cycle lane there. That same approach in Elm Grove a year ago would have resulted in many cyclists regarding the trial lanes as having some form of successful outcome. We would like to see a similar approach taken here, where an existing and well-used cycle lane is protected to allow cyclists safe access to the junction, to take advantage of the advanced stop line and early release lights, and experience the benefit of being prioritised for using active travel and reducing motor vehicle journeys within the city. We would also like to point out that the Elm Grove Kings Road route is also outside of the clean air zone and has the potential to act as a conduit towards the east of the city without travelling through the CAS. This could well result in an increase in traffic along this route and therefore an increase in danger towards those people choosing more sustainable forms of travel. To conclude, Elm Grove, Grove Road Junction does need improving. We support the scheme to make changes to protect vulnerable road users. We have both new ideas and previously submitted suggestions and are happy to discuss these as detailed designs are further developed. However, we do not believe that the assigned budget of £40,000 is sufficient given the required scope of the project. And briefly, on the measures on this agenda item, we welcome any form of data collection that helps officers identify locations for potential schemes, monitor any changes following their implementation, and report where they have been successful, in turn identifying the approaches that can be taken on future projects.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Heaney.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously this was one of the areas of concern to me in particular because it's obviously right on my ward, on the boundaries and so on, so I'm obviously aware of it. And of course I do use the junction as well. I think the problem with the junction Ian's highlighted some of the issues around cycle usage, etc. But of course, if you look at the shape of that junction, it's a slightly odd shape because it has angles which wouldn't normally operate on a crossroads if it was a straight sort of, proper cross shape. So it does create some particular difficulties. And I was wondering whether the scheme doesn't actually specify what measures are going to be brought in, but clearly one of the issues is vehicles particularly coming out of Grove Road South and turning east, and similarly vehicles coming from Grove Road North and turning to go west. And I'm wondering if there could be something done to the lights which would allow a filter function, which would allow vehicles coming out and filtering and turning to turn when vehicles coming from either north or south were prohibited. So you as you turn, because some junctions, if you go there, you'll see lights which are green and there's a filter light, and you can only go to the right or to the left to the right across the road when the filter light is actually on. Obviously, Arundel Street, Fratton Road is a good example. So I'm just wondering whether you could consider something like that would help cyclists, because the other suggestion that's made obviously is to make all of the four roads the cycle priority to go first. That's fine if you're first in the queue, but if you're a little bit behind and you haven't got there yet, you are still potentially going to face a vehicle that's trying to turn across your path, and that doesn't necessarily protect you. So we need to think about that. I don't know the technicalities, and obviously I'm not expecting an answer now, but again, it'd be useful if the ward councillors, because it obviously affects the adjacent ward as well, were told about what the proposals were. I suppose the other thing is, if there is a solution which will work, and it's going to be slightly more than the budget, what flexibility is there going to be to actually put in a scheme that will work, rather than putting in a measure that may only partially affect the safety of the junction? Because I think in some ways, with such a major junction, it's better to do the job right first time rather than to try and do something and then have to come back and do some amendments later. So I'd be interested to know whether there's any flexibility to go beyond the budgeted amount. I mean, the other ones, obviously, I'm very happy to see those proceed as well.
Thank you. Councillor Bosher.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stagg. Again, the junction that we are talking about there is not one that I use frequently, so it's not one that I necessarily pick up on the issues, but Councillor Healy is quite right. The angle of that junction and the fact that it approaches Elm Grove, Kings Road at angles probably doesn't help itself in that respect. So I do tend to agree in the fact that I hope we have a system that is workable rather than just spend a little bit of money to do something that is just going to potentially not solve the problem and just irritate everybody if we're not careful. So where we go with that, and I'd be interested to see, and please keep myself and Graham in the loop as to where that budget actually goes in that respect, because clearly that's going to have an impact on potentially some of the other things that you're looking to do as part of LTP4, and it'll be interesting to see what falls off the edge as much as anything else. Ian made a comment about early release cycle lights, traffic lights. Therein, I have a slight issue. I'm not against them, but are we just putting them in at every single set of traffic lights for the benefit of cyclists, or are we actually thinking this through on occasion? And the reason I'm saying this, because I have them in my ward. I have them at the top of the Eastern Road, east-west, Havant Road. And the lanes there are very narrow, so there is no dedicated cycle lane, and there's no what I would call a green refuse at the front for cyclists to go to. So you end up with a situation where car drivers can legitimately pull up right to the traffic lights, and the early release system is literally right here in their visibility line. So you end up with a situation that when that starts to go green, they start to move forward because they've got a green light in their peripheral vision. Now, that to me is a potential accident waiting to happen, because the number of vehicles you see sort of driving forward and then slamming their brakes on because they've gone off 4 seconds early when there are still other vehicles from other areas on the junction is an issue. Now, I understand the fact that it is narrow lanes that prevent this green refuse being at the front of it, but it sort of does beg the question, were early release cycle lights appropriate for that sort of a junction? Because I'm yet to be convinced that they are, and it is a junction that I use on a daily basis, and it happens just about every single time that I go through that junction. Somebody lurches forward, slams their brakes out, and you're going to get a rear end shunt if you're not careful. But that's a particular comment that I would make on that. That's not to say I'm not a supporter of them. I just think perhaps we need to look at the junctions and say, are they appropriate for the junction, or is there an alternative method? Ironically, the west to east ones, cyclists tend to just go up on the pavement, just go round the traffic lights and keep on going. They never use the lane there at all. So whether it's red or green, they just keep going. So that's one aspect that I would perhaps ask if somebody could just feed back, doesn't have to be here, and just let me know, and I'm sure the Cycle Forum are going to stick pins in me now for saying something like that, but I think we need to understand the reason why I'm saying it. The other comment that I would make, and I did make it at the briefing, it's good to see that Lower Farlington Road has finally found itself onto the list to be looked at, but that is, again, the speed surveys do not tell the whole story. They tell you that vehicles are perhaps exceeding the speed, but the problem with Lower Farlington Road goes much further than that and perhaps needs a bit more of a root and branch investigation. It is a route that articulated vehicles use to access the Fitzherbert Road industrial area by coming off at the A3 roundabout along the Havant Road and trying to turn left down there, down a very narrow road, and once they get going down there, they will just carve their way on down, when in fact they shouldn't do. It's also a rat run to avoid the Sainsbury's junction for all those sorts of vehicles in reverse. So you end up with an awful lot of vehicles there that are either articulated or what I would call very heavy goods vehicles belting up and down that particular stretch of road through a residential area which has routes to school on it, and so a lot of these vehicle movements are at that sort of time in the morning and mixing with young children. And there's also a sports field there which is regularly used most weekends as well for the same particular reason. So I would hope that when we look at these speed surveys, we don't just look at them in isolation and say, yes, there is a speed problem, but we actually do drill down into other issues that we might have with that, because that road in my ward has been one that has been something that regularly comes along year after year after year, and we've sort of fiddled around the edges and looked at it, and nothing has actually significantly been achieved. So that's a comment about a road in my particular ward that I'm quite familiar with, and hopefully you'll engage with the Drayton and Farlington councillors and look beyond just a speed survey into other issues in that road.
Thank you. Michelle or Joe, have you got any comment on that? I don't want to put you on the spot because I realise, money is a problem.
Well, with reference to the low-level cycle lights, that project is managed through our colleagues in the network management team, but I'll certainly take your comments forward. They have developed a presentation for this year's low-level cycle lights budget, so if you'd be interested in having a further discussion with Katie, who's the project manager, then we can certainly put something in the diary so that we can have a conversation about that, and she would be the best person to answer those specific questions about the lack of forward stop line that you were mentioning. With regard to Low Farlington, yes, absolutely. The speed surveys are a starting point. We need to have that evidence base to show whether or not interventions are necessary. But as we discussed at briefing, that has a particular set of circumstances with the HGVs accessing Waterworks Road and the industrial estate where Sainsbury's is and using it as a cut through. So we need that as a starting point, but we certainly wouldn't use it as the only source of evidence. There would obviously be engagement with residents and with local ward councillors. As we discussed at briefing, there is the option of an environmental weight limit, which can be explored, and also the option of infrastructure, so engineered build-outs, etc. That's not for this budget because it is speed reduction, but we can certainly take the data that we have from the speed reduction survey and anything else that we collect and take it forward to a future bid.
Yes.
That's fine, as long as we can look at it, because there are two other aspects. Sat-navs tends to send people along the Havant Road and down Lower Farlington, God help us, why? And when you've got an articulated lorry that's driving across a pub car park and getting halfway down and then realising they can't do it and trying to reverse back out again, it's a complete and utter nightmare. And the Havant Road also becomes the default alternative when they're doing roadworks on the A27. So yet again, it becomes that default cut through to get to Fitzherbert Road, when ideally they could go along to the traffic lights Eastern Road and go the long way round. So whichever way you look at it, it's the residents in that area that are actually suffering, and some of the HGVs, and it's probably my perception more than anything because I've seen them do it, suddenly realise they're driving down into a residential area and tend to speed up. In other words, if I speed up, I can get out of this residential area quicker. I don't know whether that's my perception of it, but that's how it seems to come across to me. And when you've got a heavy-duty articulated lorry going down a quite a narrow residential road, I'm gobsmacked that there hasn't been anything more serious, but we have had them at the pinch point at the bottom just go straight through them and take the bollards out and drive into a couple of walls down there in the past as well.
Thanks, Simon. I've got two questions, and that was two things brought up about the low level of lights, the street lights at on Elm Grove at that junction. Is there anything we can do to improve that? Can we investigate it?
We can definitely investigate.
I'm not asking
it.
for a yes or no today, but can we investigate?
I think definitely as part of the engagement with stakeholders and other people like ward councillors, then that's going to throw up things like this that you don't necessarily notice at the start of a project. So in terms of the way that we need to address all of the problems at the site, we'll definitely try and look into everything that's raised and liaise with other officers and other colleagues that are more responsible for things like lighting. Good, thank you. And the other thing was the low-level cycle lights. You know, was it Grove Road North doesn't have those? Yes. Paul Darlow didn't mention those today, did he, in the briefing?
We did have a brief discussion about them in briefing this morning, Councillor Stagg. And
was Grove Road North mentioned?
So it wasn't on the list,
No,
and obviously
right, yes.
the action that came out of that presentation this morning was that councillors would like to see that junction added to the list for low-level cycle lights. So Katie took that away as part of the feedback from the presentation to look at the prioritised list.
Thanks. Well, I agree with your points about motorists, because I brought this up this morning's briefing and the last one as well. When I'm driving up Fratton Road to turn right into St Mary's Road, because I'm a very good, well-behaved driver, I turn my engine off when I get to a queue. But I use those low-level cycle lights to warn me that the lights are going to change so I can turn my engine back on again. But so often I see the car in front going out as soon as it comes onto amber, actually, it will go. And the same thing happens at Stubbington Avenue. So there's some driver education, I think, that's needed. How successful that would be, I don't know.
I think if I can come back on that, Lynn, I think my issue perhaps with the one that I'm familiar with is that most of the time where you see these low-level cycle releases, there is, I'll call it a green refuse at the front on at the stop sign, at the stop light, if you like. So a car is normally further back so they've actually got visibility of the traffic light itself, which is the guiding factor, and the cyclists may or may not be in front of them. It depends whether there's any cyclists around. Where you don't have that green refuse, it staggers the stopping point of the vehicle back. The first car at the front might not necessarily see the traffic light there or be looking at the one that's further down there, but they suddenly get an amber and a green in their peripheral vision here, and the subconscious moves them forward. Now, you could make that about driver awareness, but I think it is perhaps a distraction in some instances that perhaps needs to be reviewed to say, is this appropriate to actually put here, or if it is there some sort of mitigation that we can have by perhaps moving the stop line back a little bit so that it doesn't become the distraction in the driver's peripheral vision?
Sorry, have you got any more questions, Ian?
No, I would just point out to Councillor Bosher that we have actually wondered why the low-level cycle lights were put on that junction, because there are no way for a cyclist to access it if there's already traffic on the road.
Right.
So,
okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I think I would go along with the recommendations made. You've got a lot of work there to do. I realise that. But yes,
Thank you, Councillor Stagg.
it's good. Right, where are we now? Item number 5, on-street residential charge points, charge scheme, phase 1, end of the review. Hayley, I guess it's you, is it? Oh, no, it's Felicity.
Thank you. I'm going to present the report today. So this report reviews the first phase of the on-street residential charge point scheme and makes recommendations for how to take forward the scheme following the end of the 3-year trial on the 5th of March 2022. So just to provide you with a short background of the paper, there are 36 on-street charge points which were installed in residential streets in March 2019. The charge points utilise spare lamp column electricity supply and were either retrofitted to the lamp columns in streets where these were positioned in front of the footway, or in a slimline bollard where the lamp columns were positioned at the rear of the footway. The locations were selected based on resident requests, and the supplier Ubitricity was appointed through a full tender process. So the data to date demonstrates that the charge points are all well utilised. Keeping them in place will continue to promote the continued usage and increase the use of electric vehicles in our city. For the locations that do not achieve as much usage, we will work to improve the utilisation of these charge points. Therefore, the report recommends today that the Cabinet Member for Traffic and Transportation firstly approves the extension of the current contract with Ubitricity for a period of up to 3 years from the expiry of the existing contract on the 5th of March 2022, with delegated authority to the Director of Regeneration to finalise the details of any changes to the current terms, working closely with finance, procurement and legal regarding this. And secondly, approves the charge point infrastructure, which has been identified with current low usage, should be the subject of further marketing and promotional activity with a review in 6 months to determine their future. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Councillor Bosher.
We're all in agreement, I think. It's another report that I'm completely supportive. It's something that I started, and I'm pleased to see that you're carrying on with Lynn and rolling it out, because if we want the city to move more over to electric vehicles, then we've got to provide the infrastructure to allow that to happen. We've just got to wait for the car manufacturers to actually start lowering the price of their vehicles and making them more affordable. But I don't think we can really control that here, to be quite frank with you. I'm also quite pleased that we're looking, having introduced the clean air zone, we've actually are looking to focus a little bit more on the taxi and the private hire vehicles, because the current system where we concentrated on where the demand was for residential vehicles sort of excluded the taxi trade to a certain degree, and making them available for them to be able to charge their vehicles will encourage take-up of those vehicles through government grants, etc. So that is, to me, is a good thing. I think A lot more marketing would be good. Don't disagree with that. I think we need to get that message out, particularly as we have the negativity of, or perceived negativity from motorists of a clean air zone and the fact that it is going to cost you money to drive into it. There's always the but. We have the infrastructure to support electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, etc., etc. My next vehicle is probably going to be a hybrid rather than electric, but we've got to do something with the amount of vehicles, amount of mileage I actually do in my job. It'll take me 3.5 days to get to Birmingham and back, but hey-ho. But yes, pleased that we're doing it. We're also looking at rolling out more into car parks, council-owned car parks, which I think is a good way. One question I'd have is what engagement are we having with the owners of private vehicles, private car parks rather, like the Pompey Centre, to get them to put it in? I mean, we need, if we're going to put the infrastructure in, it would be good to see some of the major supermarkets and developments like that also going down the line. Some are beginning to do it, but I've sort of noticed that they're perhaps being particularly slow in Portsmouth, and I would like to see more going into some of those car parks, particularly in the north of the city where I'm familiar with, and see whether we can actually make it work as a holistic approach as much as anything. There was one other thing I wanted to look at. We're extending the contract. Now, from the briefing, I seem to recollect that was more to do with the actual charging points, so we have the flexibility, because one of the concerns I would have is if we are sticking with the same supplier, are we getting best value for the money for the residents of the city? Do we have the flexibility to change suppliers in the same way that, all right, current energy prices aside, but most residents have the ability to flip their suppliers to their domestic requirements. Do we have that similar capability going forward to do that with our supplier to electric vehicle charging points?
Who's going to answer that one? Is it Hayley or Felicity? Hayley.
Yeah, so on the first point around private car parks, definitely that's something we will take forward. When we're looking at our off-street car parks that we have control of, we'll also consider the private ones in the city as part of that, and try and ensure that they're putting those in. In terms of your second point on whether or not we can change suppliers, the current electricity charge points are what's called OPCC compliant, which means that it's open charge protocol and any other supplier can take them on. I think it can be complicated, and I think at the moment suppliers are potentially making income from the installation rather than the usage, so it's not necessarily as attractive, but it's something in the future that could be done.
Is that more of a software function rather than the physical charge point thing then, Hayley?
Yeah, so the physical charge point could remain, and then the software for the back office could be taken over by a new supplier and new software.
Okay, so I guess really we're looking at some sort of government legislation to make it easy to actually move these things around once the electric vehicle charging points start to become more popular. The other thing that came out quite recently from COP26 are plans that every new build is to have an electric vehicle charging point. As traffic and transportation, are we engaging with planning as to some sort of policy around that, or is it just one of those things that we've made a mental note of for a future discussion?
I believe planning are looking at the parking supplementary planning document, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure will be fully put in that in the updated version. So, and we're working with them on it.
I know at planning committee meetings, that's the question is always asked, and most of the time there are plans to put not necessarily one per household, but certainly a number in developments. Councillor Heaney.
Yes, thank you. I I support the extension of the contract. I don't think that's a problem. There was just a couple of issues I wanted to raise about that, because on the section 7, which talks about the extending the current contract, it does raise a number of issues around the fact the warranty on the equipment is coming to an end, therefore maintenance will presumably fall on either the supplier or us, and we talk about whether it should be us or the supplier. I just think that whatever we decide, we should try and be consistent, because if we're going to do this, I would think we need to think about, well, what would we do if we were having hundreds of these points across the city? Because I think we want a system that actually works for the future, not just for this particular contract, that we might have to change it later, because you don't want one set of rules for the early installation system and then a later set of rules for the later installation, because I think that would be potentially problematic. So all I'm saying there is consistency around the issues. I can see the issues that have been raised, and clearly if we are going to take on the responsibility for maintenance because we want to keep the charge low, then we have to anticipate what the potential increase in charging points across the city might be in, how many years' time, and what that might mean for our budgets, because we obviously face pressures on that. So I'm just thinking through that consistency will be quite useful. Maybe we could be, although we're happy to delegate, that we are given some sort of final heads up on what is actually agreed, so we know what the final contract looks like. Would be quite useful. And possibly, if we have any questions, enough time to ask them and answer them before the contract is finally signed, because it does say you have 3 months to effectively negotiate it. So I think that might be useful for us. The only other one that sort of comes to mind is also thinking about the future extension of points, electric charging points. And there's a section 512 to 515 which talks about how they operate at the moment and the issue of people leaving their cars in charging points. The report suggests that anyone who actually has a charging point outside their house should expect to charge their car, but then be willing to move their car anytime between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. to allow other people to use it. But as anyone knows, whether you have a parking zone or whether you don't have a parking zone, that is not always easy to do. And sometimes people just don't do it. And that is obviously going to cause a bit of an issue, because clearly if we're going to introduce charging points, we can't actually introduce them for every parking space on every road, because that's just not feasible. It's just not going to be feasible. So we're going to have to find a way of how we're going to deal with that. As I understand it at the moment, we don't penalise drivers for parking in the EV parking space if they have an electric vehicle and they're charged. And if that space is vacant, do we actually prevent other vehicles from parking? I don't think we do we? We don't prevent other vehicles from parking in those spaces. Is that correct?
Hayley.
So the parking bays are enforceable if a non-electric vehicle is parked in there, or even an electric vehicle that's not plugged in. They can be enforced with a PCN.
Oh, right. So that's interesting, because it wasn't clear from the report that's actually what happens. I haven't heard of anybody having that happen. I don't know how many. Maybe I'll need to ask the question about how many have been done. I mean, I can see why you might want to do that, but the trouble is, if we're going to extend these, I think we're going to have to rethink that, because it's going to be very difficult to create lots of empty spaces in the roads around the city for electric charging, because I'm just thinking of the logistics of it. There's a long-term issue that's creeping up on us, shall I say. It's not going to be a problem tomorrow or the day after.
You're going to end up with a tipping point at some point where we have more, and it's where that tipping point actually is.
Yeah.
Because I guess the utopia would be an electric vehicle charging point available in every street for every space. Yes. That's probably where we're heading, in which case there is going to be a tipping point, in which case where the electric vehicles outnumber the old-fashioned diesel and petrol vehicles, and then you can say perhaps we do away with it.
Yeah, you sort of sold that. That's really the issue. All I'm saying is we need to anticipate that in terms of how we set up the
In some
rules.
places at the moment, residents have worked out a rota between them. If there's several people in a road.
Oh, yeah.
So it makes for better communities if people communicate with each
I
other.
think the other sort of thing that anticipating, many years down the road is,
Yeah.
I don't think we can just rely on the idea of petrol and diesel vehicles being replaced by electric vehicles, because that will just mean congestion by a different sort of vehicle. It might be cleaner and it might be nicer, but it'll still be congestion. So,
But it could be hydrogen.
It could be
vehicles as
hydrogen,
well,
yeah.
so You have
yeah.
another problem.
Yeah. So anyway, it's just a few observations on the longer term thing. A bit about the contract to make sure we have consistency. Maybe get a bit of a feedback on what we eventually do agree, and the issue about how we deal with parking and spaces in the future. We're not at it yet, but I think it's worth thinking about it, about what we might do at some point.
One thing that struck me, Hayley, is some of the charging points are used very little. So what would you intend to do if, it could be for a good reason, like somebody may have moved away and not have an electric car. Do you still leave those charging points in place, but deactivate them as far as, so that non-electric vehicles can park in them, or what?
So I think initially, there is one still without a marked bay. That might be the reason that particular one is low use. The other ones, we would promote them in the local areas, neighbouring roads. If we still didn't get take up, one consideration could be to remove the parking bay if that was marked, leave the charge point in place to see if anyone did take up the car, but you're not taking out the parking bay. The final option would be to relocate that elsewhere if it really wasn't the demand for it in that particular area.
It seems a pity to remove something, though, if it then would be used later on by somebody else in the road, isn't it? And I think that's something maybe we need to consider at some point.
Personally, I wouldn't be seeking to remove the infrastructure, Lynn. I think if it's in there because there was a demand in the first place, the fact that people might relocate, I think you still leave it there. Sod's Law says you'll take it away, and 6 months later you'll have a request to put one back in the same road.
Yes. Anyway, I'm happy to go along with the recommendations. I think it's great. And good luck in getting funding for the phase 3, yes? And I think that's it, everybody. Thank you very much.